She boarded the plane like anyone else, quiet, tired, hoping for rest. As her eyes closed, the cabin hummed with the usual rhythm of a journey in the sky. But while she slept, something far darker was unfolding. A glance, a whisper, a doubt that spread like wildfire. By the time the captain's voice cracked over the speakers, fear had already filled the cabin. She had no idea that her very presence, her skin, her silence, would turn this flight into a nightmare. What happens when simply falling asleep becomes the spark for suspicion? Stay with me, because this story will leave you questioning everything. Her name was Maya, a young professional returning from a long week of work. She loved traveling, seeing the world, meeting new people, and this flight was supposed to be just another routine trip. A chance to rest her head against the window, drift off to the sound of engines, and wake up closer to her destination. Nothing unusual, but Maya carried with her more than a suitcase and a boarding pass. She carried the quiet resilience of someone who had grown used to being judged before being known. In airports, she had felt the stares linger a little too long, the questions asked a little too sharply. Yet she kept moving forward, determined not to let prejudice define her path. As she settled into her seat and closed her eyes, the world seemed calm, ordinary. But beneath the calm, something invisible was taking shape. A seed of suspicion, a ripple that would soon swell into a storm. What should have been a simple nap in the sky was about to become the beginning of a nightmare. The hum of the engines should have been comforting, a steady lullaby that promised safety high above the clouds. But somewhere in the cabin, a ripple of unease began to spread. A passenger shifted in their seat, whispering to another. Eyes darted toward Maya, still asleep, her head gently pressed against the window. To her, nothing was wrong. To others, her presence became a question mark. One man signaled a flight attendant, pointing discreetly. Another joined in, their whispers laced with suspicion. Words like strange and watching her floated through the air, poisoned by bias and unfounded fear. The flight attendant tried to calm them, but doubt is a wildfire. It spreads faster than reason. Soon, a handful of passengers leaned forward, glancing nervously at Maya as if her very stillness was dangerous. The murmurs reached the cockpit. The captain, already tense from storm warnings ahead, received a note passed through the crew. It said only, "Concerns about a passenger." A vague phrase, but one heavy with implications. His voice tightened as he prepared to make an announcement. Meanwhile, Maya stirred faintly, unaware that strangers were casting shadows over her safety. Then it came, the captain's voice over the intercom. Measured, professional, but lined with an edge of fear. If there's anyone on board with military flying experience, please make yourself known. The cabin froze. Passengers gasped, some clutched armrests, others glanced wildly at one another. What could possibly demand a fighter pilot in the middle of a commercial flight? Panic bubbled beneath the surface, but the unspoken target of suspicion was clear. Eyes fell back on Maya, as though her closed eyes held the answer to a threat no one could name. Maya finally opened her eyes, disoriented by the shift in the cabin's energy. She saw the stairs, felt the weight of fear that had nothing to do with turbulence. Her heart pounded as she pieced together fragments of whispers, the darting glances, the way people leaned away from her. The cruel realization landed like a blow. It wasn't what she had done. It was who she was. The plane, thousands of feet above the earth, had become a stage where prejudice played out in real time. Every breath she took seemed scrutinized, every blink misinterpreted. She adjusted her seatbelt, her hands trembling, but even that small movement triggered gasps. To them, she was no longer a tired traveler. She was a question mark, a threat, an enemy painted by nothing more than the color of her skin. The captain's announcement ended, but the silence that followed was suffocating. Maya's throat tightened. How do you defend yourself against fear that has no evidence? How do you fight suspicion that needs no proof? She wanted to speak, to stand, to tell them she was just like everyone else. But the thought of moving under so many watchful eyes filled her with dread. And just as she gathered the courage to say something, the plane jolted suddenly in turbulence. Gasps turned into cries. Passengers clutched their seats. And in that moment of chaos, every eye snapped back to her. The turbulence settled, but the fear did not. A flight attendant, pale and uneasy, walked slowly down the aisle. Every step seemed louder than the roar of the engines. And then she stopped at Maya's row. Passengers held their breath, their eyes wide with expectation, as though waiting for a hidden truth to be revealed. "Ma'am, we need to speak with you." Maya's chest tightened. Her palms slick with sweat, she unbuckled her seatbelt as whispers rose around her. Each sound cut deeper, confirming that suspicion had already written her guilt. She stood, her legs unsteady, and followed the attendant while every pair of eyes burned into her back. In the narrow galley, 2 crew members stood with folded arms. Their voices were low, their words polite, but their eyes betrayed something harsher: distrust. They asked her questions without evidence, pressing for explanations she didn't owe. Who was she? Why was she traveling? Why had she been so quiet? Every answer she gave was swallowed by silence. Nothing she said could erase the narrative the passengers had already built. And in that moment, Maya understood the most painful truth. She was not being judged for her actions, but for her existence. Her heart pounded as she glanced back into the cabin. Dozens of faces stared, some fearful, some accusatory, none willing to see her as simply human. She felt stripped bare, her dignity hanging in the balance. The captain's voice returned, calm yet trembling. "Ladies and gentlemen, please remain seated. Everything is under control." But Maya knew better. Nothing was under control because prejudice had already taken over the cockpit, the cabin, and the hearts of those around her. And as she stood there, isolated and accused, one haunting thought echoed in her mind. If this is what happens in the sky, where could she ever truly be safe? Maya was eventually allowed to return to her seat. No weapons were found, no danger uncovered, no truth revealed, because there was never a threat to begin with. Only fear, suspicion, and prejudice disguised as caution. The flight continued, but for Maya nothing felt ordinary anymore. The quiet she had once cherished in the air was now poisoned by humiliation, by the memory of dozens of eyes that saw her not as a fellow traveler, but as a danger. She carried that weight off the plane, and it did not stay behind in the terminal. It followed her into her thoughts, into her heart, reminding her that safety is never guaranteed when skin itself is treated like evidence. For Maya, it was a moment in time. For millions of others, it is a lifetime of echoes. Because this isn't just one woman's story, it's a reflection of a much larger truth. A truth about how quickly bias can spread, how fear can override reason, and how racism can turn the simplest act, like sleeping on a plane, into a stage for judgment. And so, we are left with a question. How many more Mayas must endure suspicion before we learn to see people for who they are, not for what we fear they might be? This story is not meant to fade with the closing credits. It is meant to linger, to challenge, to make us look harder at the world around us. If it unsettled you, it should. Because change doesn't come from comfort. It comes from courage. So will we keep looking away? Or will we finally confront the prejudice that still takes flight every single day?